Welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to take a look at how museums conserve leather. And that can help in a few different ways. So by the end, you'll learn the difference between how museums conserve leather and how everyday, people like us work with leather. You'll see some of the conservation methods that museums use. And then we'll go through a few tips on how you can apply these to your leather care and conservation at home so that you can get some of the benefits of museum level conservation, but in an easy way that you could use at home. So with that, let's dive right in. For the leather goods that we use often, like belts and watch straps and wallets, those things that we use every day, our main goal is to maintain them so that they look good, and they work well. Where museums, on the other hand, their goal is primarily about conservation. What they really want to do is maintain the structural integrity of that leather for decades or even centuries. So they're essentially two different purposes. We want them to perform well and look good while using them, whereas museums want to maintain the leather for as long as possible. And so that leads to two different fundamental approaches to how that leather is actually cared for and conserved. So where typically we'll clean stains, museums will merely note the stain as part of that item's history. Because sometimes through cleaning, it could actually damage the fibers more. And there's also a huge difference in conditioning, pretty much a surprise when I found out. So we'll share more about that in just a few moments. Let's take a look at a few of the more popular museum conservation methods so you can get an idea of what they're doing and then how we may be able to apply that to our leather goods. The first is wet cleaning. And the introduction of significant moisture can be really damaging to vintage leather fibers for a good number of reasons. So as such, wet cleaning is very, very rarely, if ever, done for museums. They're usually never cleaned with water. However, in those rare cases that it is, I'll show you an example. We want to use distilled water because water from the tap, streams, rivers, things like that have microscopic minerals that are, as part of it. And so distilled water goes through a process that removes all that and gives you as pure a water as possible. And that way, when that goes into the material and it evaporates, it does not leave anything behind. And furthermore, if anything is going to be cleaned with water, it's usually used doing a very soft sponge, and it's often dabbed, and very rarely, if ever, rubbed, because rubbing can move dirt around the surface and create scratches, whereas dabbing does the least amount of potential damage to that leather. And so that's wet cleaning. It's very, very rarely ever done for leather in museums. So next up is something called dry cleaning. And so we're familiar with the dry cleaner, and conserving leather in museums is a little different when it comes to dry cleaning. So let's take a look at a few of the more popular methods of dry cleaning for leather in museums. We have vacuuming. What? It sounds crazy, but it's true. So sometimes there are leather fibers that are going to be dirty on the surface, and there's some surface dirt like dust and dirt, and we're able to clean that with vacuuming. So what we want to do is typically use a gauze layer put over the end of the vacuum tip. And that way, as that vacuum is being used, ideally it's not touching, but even if it does touch a little bit, it's not going to abrade and rub off some of those loose fibers on top. It'll ideally only pick up the items that are dust or not part of the fiber itself. You could use a small vacuum like this. It allows you to get pretty closely into those fibers. However, there is a risk of, if the leather is loose or flaking or cracked, that vacuuming can actually pull out more of the leather fibers itself, along with the dust and dirt as well. So this is a approach that typically you want to use with discretion. If you think that it can do more help than good, it's definitely an approach that can be taken. Another dry cleaning method is dusting. And with dusting, what we'll typically want to use is a very soft camel hair brush. And this will abrade the leather fibers the least while giving some ability to brush off dust and dirt and grime from that leather. And how that's done is typically, just very gentle brushing depending on what is trying to be cleaned off. And that will slowly remove those dirt and grime from the leather surface without doing damage as much as possible to the fibers that remain. Another option at our disposal is forced air. So where we looked at the vacuum earlier, some of these vacuums can go bidirectionally. So it can vacuum in and it can also shoot air out. And so when we switch it to the air function, where it's actually blowing air on it, then that can be used just like if you're cleaning your keyboard to remove dust. It can also be used to remove dust and grime from fibers. Again, it's important to be aware that it's not so strong that it's actually pushing the fibers away, but instead, it's just moving the dust and dirt that's on top of those fibers out. As a general recommendation, you want to keep the maximum pressure at 40 psi or less, and that will make sure that you're not putting too much force from that air, onto that leather. And of course, as gentle as possible that it works is the way to go. So if you can keep it even lower, that's going to be great. The artist eraser is yet another useful and tried and true technique for some conservators. It's very dependent upon what the eraser is made of. So you want to use one that has the proper composition. And it's generally used to remove tough residue or deposit spots. And there even may be some eraser residue left after you are done using this, because the eraser, as it's being used, obviously wears itself out and leaves a little bit of that eraser dust. So after that, you may decide to use your camel hair brush and then remove those eraser things. In general, this is going to be used very sparingly for tough residue and things like that. But it is a relatively non-invasive process if done gently with the proper eraser and care. So let's talk applicators. If we are applying anything to the leather, whether it be water for wet cleaning or anything else that we may use, we generally want to use one of two types of items. And these are going to be a cotton material, cotton cloth that's very soft and it's a natural fiber, or we want to use a foam sponge. And the type of sponge is very specific. It's usually going to be a latex-free polyurethane foam sponge. And these are often referred to as cosmetic sponges. And so just be aware that you want to find the right type of material. And in that way, it'll be gentle on your leather goods, and still work. It's usually used for dabbing, not really for rubbing. The rubbing could cause abrasions from that dirt being rubbed into the material. So again, whenever we use these types of applicators, we want to primarily dab very gently and not rub. So when it comes to conditioners, what exactly do museums use? And this is something I was really excited to learn about, because I figured, they're working with some of the most important, artifacts that we've got in the world. What are they doing? That can help inform what we do in much more educated ways. So, what conditioners do they use? I was surprised. None. What? That sounds crazy. So different leathers in museums, depending upon the time it was made, the tanning process used, and all sorts of variables that are part of it, can actually make using different conditioners and different combinations of chemical elements oxidizing and actually damage that leather. And there are so many unique combinations of leather throughout the different times that it makes it, depending upon the state of decay, pretty much non-advisable to add additional oils and fats and chemicals into it, because that could actually lead to further degradation of the fibers and accelerated weakening of them as well. And so I was like, well, that kind of makes sense, but isn't it just going to dry out and rot over time, and then you're going to lose your leather anyway? Duh, museum, why don't you condition it? So the reality is, when leather is meant only for observation and not for handling, it doesn't really need to be that flexible. It can be stiffer or drier, and basically maintain its structure. And the whole point of the museum conservation is to just do that. It's about maintaining fiber strength, which doesn't need that flexibility. And so when items are stored properly in a museum, in the proper light, in the proper humidity, and the proper temperature, then there isn't a lot of that expansion and contraction that is going to require those oils to help maintain the flexibility of those fibers. Essentially, when an item is in a museum, it's going to be in the same state, in the same way, for the same time, in the same conditions for a very long period of time. And because of that, it simply doesn't need that flexibility. And without all those fluctuations and those chemicals going in and out, those fibers are going to essentially stay the way they are. And so that kind of like totally opened me up to a new way of thinking, because I had always thought that we want to oil and condition our leather to maintain its strength and durability, and it's going to be context dependent. If we're using it day to day, yes. If we are looking to store it in a museum, for decades or centuries, we simply want to keep those fibers from breaking down any further. And the best way to do that is by not touching them, keeping it in the proper humidity, keeping it within the proper temperature, and keeping it in the low light. And if we do that, the fibers will essentially maintain their integrity much longer, than if we're using it day to day. And from that use comes the need for conditioning. So overall, a really cool thing, most museums do not condition leather that they're conserving. So how about repairs? So repairs are generally evaluated on an item by item basis because each item has a unique historical context, unique makeup, maybe a unique life that it lived and where it's been and what it came into contact with. And so repairs are always essentially balanced with the idea of what is the potential damage that can come from that repair and what is the potential change in historical context versus what is best for the long-term preservation of that object. So for example, say an item was used and this book had a big ink stain because a famous person spilled their ink on it during an important event, they're probably going to leave that ink stain documented as part of the history and leave it, because trying to clean that ink would both remove that historical evidence and also potentially damage the leather around it. So in that case, you're going to look at the context of history versus preserving the item and make those discretionary calls pretty much on an item by item basis. Now, if an item does need repair, such as stitching, like this book could likely use in terms of the binding on the inside and how that is done, will usually be done in the least invasive way possible. Also, again, we're retaining that historical context of the item while giving it the best chance for long-term stability and durability. So it's pretty much a one-by-one, case-by-case basis where we want to keep the history, but also maintain the leather item as best as we can. So what can we learn from museum preservation of leather goods? It's essentially that there's two different worlds. One is the one that we most live in day to day, which is how do we maintain our leather goods for use and function and aesthetics and durability. And then there's the world of leather conservation, which is how do we keep the fibers in that leather intact for as many decades and a century as we can to preserve that history. And so it's important to realize when you're taking care of your leather goods what you want to do. Most of us are going to care for them in a day-to-day use type of basis. However, there are things that we can learn from leather conservation and how we can gently apply those methods to some of our day-to-day leather care in terms of the materials that we use and how we go about doing that. So if you have any questions, let us know. And if you have any experiences with leather museum conservation or even methods that you've applied to your leather goods, please share. We would love to learn. And there you have it. Until next time.